Recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to episode 24 of the Digital Law News series. So I'm joined today with my colleagues Peter Wright and Heather Anson, and we're just going to be discussing this week's news stories in a bit more detail. So just to introduce the firm for those who don't know, we are a specialist law firm that is based in Barnsley in the UK, and we specialise in data protection and cybersecurity and technology matters. So I'll just pass over to Peter and Heather to introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Laura. I'm Peter. I'm the Solicitor Managing Director at Digital Law, and we've got a packed schedule today with a number of technology-related stories, and we're really pleased to welcome Heather to join us in this episode because some of these stories relate to the United States, which is, of course, Heather's speciality. Heather.
Hi, yes, it's Heather Anson, and I'm a lead consultant with Digital Law, and oftentimes that means consulting on US federal law issues.
Great, thank you. So the first story we'll be starting on then, that Heather will be joining us to speak on, is the Facebook lawsuits. So the biggest tech firm are battling yet one battle, the largest tech battle yet, and one that is very long overdue. So Facebook is preparing to battle two antitrust lawsuits brought by the US government and more than 40 different US states. And they have been accused, the company, of wielding its monopoly power to crush and overwhelm its rivals. And the cases tackle Facebook's acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp in particular.
Thanks, Laura. I think this is absolutely fascinating because we've covered on our discussions previously the advent of the EU's Digital Services Act, which is going to potentially introduce significantly greater regulation of tech corporations and introduce significant limits on things like their publishing and how they act as gateways for smaller corporations. So, for example, Amazon and its Gate and its marketplace, Apple and all the game and app developers on there. And sort of at the same time as facing that threat there in the European Union, we've got the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, which is looking at increasing regulation as well. And now we've got this in the United States. And this is where I wanted to bring in Heather to update us on the US position here.
Yes, but this is a little bit different from some of the regulations we're looking at in terms of monitoring content or working about what speech and it can happen and how these social media companies need to regulate themselves. What this is an attack on how Facebook is structured and using antitrust laws, which we also colloquially term in the US monopoly. They've created a monopoly in social media, and this was triggered by the fact that they tend to purchase any social media app that becomes popular that isn't as nearly as large as them, such as WhatsApp and Instagram. And a lot of people don't even know that Facebook actually is the owner of Instagram and WhatsApp. So the main aim of these lawsuits is not to regulate the company, break it up, to say that Facebook can't also own Instagram and WhatsApp, saying that they are dominating the market to the point that it's stifling competition. That, in the end, was the true aim of the antitrust laws in the US, the anti-monopoly laws in the US, is to break up companies when they got too big to the point where they were not allowing others in the market to thrive.
Okay,
right, absolutely.
So I was just going to say, in terms of who's actually bringing these actions, is this through the US regulator, so for example the Federal Trade Commission, or it's also the fact that the US government and these 40 different states?
Right, it's brought by the US government's Department of Justice, but it's also backed up by the district attorneys in these different states. When it says 40 states, that's the district attorneys or the state's district attorneys or the federal district attorneys in those different jurisdictions, because it's, again, something we've discussed before, federalist state. the idea is that antitrust isn't just a federal issue, it's also a state issue. So these states are joining in as well. So it's a two-pronged approach on state law antitrust and federal antitrust.
Thanks. Sorry, Laura, you were trying to come in there as well.
Oh no, I was just going to ask the same question. I know, Heather, you wanted to speak about the TikTok story as well. I know a couple of months back, probably when we was on about episode 10, and we was talking a lot about TikTok. There has been an update about that, if you want to share that.
Yes, so these are the two things I was on here, for Facebook and then also for this. TikTok, owned by ByteDance in China. ByteDance had the requirement to divest themselves of the TikTok US entity by a deadline which passed 5 days ago. And that deadline has now passed. In theory, and this, I think I discussed this on the podcast earlier, the webcast earlier, when I said that it would be very difficult for this to actually be implemented, even if ByteDance didn't divest, which they haven't done. So since that deadline passed, and technically the Trump administration could try and shut down TikTok, a federal judge has stepped in again and blocked their attempt to ban the app. So we're looking at not only ByteDance not being shut down, TikTok not being shut down in the US, but the federal government, the federal judge actually saying it's not legal for the administration to even try to do so. That's the latest on the TikTok battle in the US.
Thanks, Heather. Is there any sign that in the dying days now of the Trump administration that they may come back to this, or is there attention, as we all know, directed elsewhere in terms of court cases on other issues and actions at the moment?
I think there's two possibilities, because you've got a lot of tension around China, and the Trump administration wanting to continue their stance of being very tough on China and things coming out of China, which is a lot of why this started. But that's more around commerce in China, so trade. They're going to probably shift their focus just on the trade issues, whereas this was a security issue with China, which is not something we've been hearing a lot about. And TikTok being incredibly popular in the US, I think they would have difficulty. And when it comes to the appetite in the US to go after the social media sites, they're much the general consensus is they want to see things like this Facebook lawsuit and something along the lines of how we monitor and regulate online content, as opposed to just shutting them down. That we should focus on that more than what seems to be a very impossible, difficult if not impossible ban to implement.
And the Biden administration in the run-up to the election, well, the forthcoming Biden administration, the Biden campaign at times seemed rather keen not to be outflanked on China by Trump. So very often their rhetoric was pretty aggressive on certainly a security perspective, and to a certain extent trade as well. Do you see the potential new administration next year continuing with these sorts of actions, potentially against this one against ByteDance and potentially others as well when it comes to China and technology?
I don't see them really fighting this battle on the ban, because the Biden administration, just knowing Joe Biden and his politics for the decades that he's been around, this ban was a much more reactionary measure towards China than a thought-out measure, as you see from the ban. I see the Biden administration, if it were going to do something like this, particularly around security, it would be much more measured, and we probably wouldn't be hearing about it in the news. Their approach is going to be a bit more behind the scenes, as it were, more directly working on how we can secure the U.S. from Chinese interference, without advertising to them, by the way, we're going to shut down this thing TikTok because we think you're going to steal data from it. That's not exactly the way true security, especially online, works in these times. In terms of they do have a focus on trade, but what they may do is actually use the current tariffs that are in place as a means to help them with these security things, because the trades tariffs have not actually been as successful as the Trump administration has wanted, but the Biden administration would probably be smart to keep them in place for a little while and use them as leverage, going, you know what, we could take these away, we probably should take these away, but in exchange, why don't we get some of these securities things that we want, security assurances for things like tech that's going back and forth. Also, there's a thing with China about how companies are owned, and tech companies in particular have been arguing that they need to get rid of this law in China that requires a US company that wants to do business in China to have part Chinese ownership, and to a lot of extent, the Chinese ownership takes over to some extent and takes away a lot of the power of that company. So that's something they've been trying to get rid of for a long time, and that will be something they maybe use as a negotiating tool in order to get that, is to keep these tariffs in place until they can get some concessions on those.
Indeed. So just applying as well that sort of a little bit of crystal ball gazing to 2021 and the new administration. Just looking broadly at our subject of these Facebook lawsuits and regulation of tech as a whole. I mean, if we just look at the sort of context, the Obama administration really was an administration where a lot of these organizations, from Facebook to Amazon to Apple to Google, all enjoyed stratospheric growth, really went through a significant growth phase. The Trump administration has really shied away from introducing any greater regulation or taking any big action. In the last 12 months, there have been more hearings and noises, certainly on Capitol Hill, of more, I think, from both sides, Republican and Democrat. They've sort of, I think, wanted to start looking at the way the market was behaving and potentially talking about taking more action. Do you see under this new administration that when it comes to tech regulation as a whole, they'll be perhaps picking more battles, more lawsuits like this, or do you see it being a little bit more hands-off, given that tech has been kind of a major motor for the US economy over the last decade?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult, because I think it's going to be such a huge focus for the administration post-COVID, which hopefully we'll be in a post-COVID world before the too long into his administration. Hopefully in 2 or 3 years he won't be still having to deal with a global pandemic to the scale. But their focus is going to be trying to build the economy back up, and going after the social media and tech companies that are able, if they're able to provide financial recovery. That may not be a target that they want to go after. We also have a lot stronger freedom of speech issues, freedom of expression issues in the US because of that being one of the foundations in their constitution. So it's a lot harder to go after them that way. It may be that they approach it from a different angle. This antitrust measure is one way to do it, to break things up a lot more in social media and saying you can't be over a certain size, and if you're not over a certain size, then maybe if you have more distribution of social media companies, then you have access to more information and more speech, which in US terms tends to be the more speech you have, the more freedom you have, the better things are, because you're able to counter it. Whether in truth that happens or not, I don't know. But the focus may be more on the financial side of social media and tech companies rather than trying to curb online speech.
Okay, thank you very much, Heather. I know you have to leave for another meeting, but I just wanted to say thank you for being able to drop in and join us on the broadcast this week.
No worries. Always happy to stop by.
Okay, thanks ever so much.
Bye.
Thanks, Heather. So yeah, moving on to our next story then, but staying with the Facebook, but also including Google as well. So this is more of UK regulation on the big tech firms. So this, we mentioned last week, or it might have been the week before, about the new Commission Market Authority section that they are setting up to actually look into big tech companies, and kind of similar to the act that's coming in, the Digital Services Act, kind of implementing that in the UK. So the CMA is demanding powers to stop large companies from crushing emerging rivals and harming consumers. So they're wanting the power to actually fine people who do deliberately breach a new statutory code of conduct that they plan on bringing into force, with fines up to as high as 10% of their global turnover. So this could be quite devastating for Google and Facebook if they do get these fines, and could act as a real big deterrent in ways of trying to break down some of those barriers to entry into the market.
Indeed, thanks, Laura. I think it's fascinating, given the conversation we've just had about Facebook in the US, that this is the sort of direction of travel in the UK. So, I mean, by having that large potential fines there of 10% of global turnover for any breaches of that statutory code, means that I can imagine that Facebook, Google and others will probably have lobbied to ensure that that statutory code isn't too onerous, because I'm pretty sure they wouldn't want to get hit by a fine like that. The point being that, don't forget, when it's turnover, that 10% of global turnover being wiped out could mean that that takes a large part of your profit for a year. And while it's been a record year for the tech companies this year, because of course everyone's been spending huge amounts of time online, even more so than usual, that doesn't necessarily mean, if you end up turning over more, that means you're going to end up being hit even more for a fine. And it also doesn't mean that what was a good year one year will be a good year a following year. So that's certainly a large hammer that the CMA is talking about. But it's also the fact that this could move at great speed in terms of the introduction of this, compared to in Europe, where we're awaiting the publication of the Digital Services Act on the 15th of December. But if that's anything like GDPR, we could have then a year or two of lobbying and amending and various things done to that act before it gets anywhere near being passed by the European Parliament. And let's not forget as well that the European Union is currently, a lot of its bandwidth is being taken up with responding to COVID, with dealing with the budget, and also in dealing with the UK's departure from the EU. So in the meantime, that the UK as a sort of more agile structure can potentially forge ahead by introducing a sort of next generation of regulation for large tech companies. And this is an example of where it can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting to see what the new statutory code of conduct does look like when it does come into force. But I'm guessing that'll be over the next year or so, maybe when there's when the pandemics maybe calm down a little bit.
Yes, I think you're right. I think at the moment everyone's attention is on the making sure that the best part of 60 odd million people are vaccinated. But I still think that the fact that after a year like this, the fact that the UK is spending time thinking about these proposals and publishing them shows that I think a lot of the inertia in the British government over the last 2016 to 2019, which was largely caused by Brexit, it's good that that blockage seems to have gone. Parliament is working, committees are drawing up plans, you're getting acts through Parliament, you're getting action from the regulators like this, and the machinery of government appears to be moving again, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to our next one then. So going back to referring to the European Union. So this is regarding the bulk communication laws in the UK and other countries as well. So this is a decision by the Court of Justice of the European Union on the case of Privacy International, the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs and others. So this decision was in concerning bulk surveillance, and basically the European Union, the Court of Justice, have said that as far as they are concerned, they are finding this practice to be illegal. So just so those who don't know, bulk surveillance is, a lot of us think it is just surveillance on, say, an individual or something, but me and Peter spoke about this earlier, and it is more a kind of like area wide. So for example, the police might have some intelligence that a terrorist attack is going to happen within the next month or so. So they might then go to the courts and ask for permission to do bulk surveillance on the whole of the area in which the attack is thought to be taking place. So this includes looking at everybody's communications and things like that over a whole area, for example, like Manchester or something. So this could as well also impact the UK's chance of gaining an adequate decision, because we do have these laws in the Investigatory Powers Act in the UK, and if the European Union decided to say that this practice is illegal, it could have an effect on us gaining an adequate decision.
Indeed, thanks, Laura. You've covered that very comprehensively. So, indeed, I think there's I suppose a few key takeaways from this. First of all, it's the fact that this decision is based on actions of the British government going back to 2015, so actually before the Investigatory Powers Act was brought in, but still relating to these bulk surveillance of communications practices, which are done on a broad scale by organisations like GCHQ, the government's listening post, MI5, which looks at domestic security, MI6, which looks at international security in terms of the British state, and of course then that data will potentially be shared across the with the UK's intelligence sharing partners across the Five Eyes network, so with the United States, Canada, New Zealand and Australia. And in terms of that bulk surveillance is something that, I'm afraid to say, it's something that Britain leads the world in this technology in terms of being able to look into people's communications. This interception of those communications was clarified in that Investigatory Powers Act 2016. And right from the start of the Brexit negotiations, it has been clear that the UK's surveillance practices could be a reason why an adequacy decision could be withheld. So fast forwarding from 2016 to where we are now in December 2020, we are now about 20 days away from a potential departure of the UK from the European Union with no deal and no adequacy decision. And the implication of that is that the European Union, when it makes adequacy decisions, as it has done with countries like New Zealand and Japan and Canada, they've said, right, we believe that your data protection laws are adequate, and we can send personal data of EU citizens to those countries without any concern, no controls, no nothing. Now, unfortunately, right from the start, it's been clear that because of these surveillance practices, the EU might not want to give an adequacy decision to the UK, and therefore that would mean that if it's a third-party data transfer, you have to have standard contractual clauses present. If you have if we're looking at data exchange through one organisation or a group of companies, you need to have binding corporate rules. So that's quite restrictive compared to currently, when of course there is no limit on sharing of data between the UK and the EU. And we'll be talking about this in more detail actually in a webinar next week, details of which are on our website. And that's titled Data 2021, UK, EU, Brexit, and what you need to do now to be ready. So if you're interested in that, please do register for that webinar. It's on our website. But just coming back to the story here, interestingly, Max Schrems even piped up last week. Max Schrems, infamously of the Schrems 1 and Schrems 2 decisions of the European Court. He said that he wouldn't himself end up challenging any UK adequacy decision. He'd leave someone else to sue that, because he said it would be so easy to challenge it based on the UK's surveillance laws. So you're like, oh great. Actually, that he sees this as being such a slam dunk that he doesn't merit it as it merits his attention, which is a great deal, unfortunately. But I think the takeaway is that an adequacy decision is not a foregone conclusion, and therefore organisations need to be making preparations for an adequacy decision not being in place come the new year. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think a few things that people need to be doing is say like reviewing contracts, making sure that the standard contractual clauses are in place. But obviously, like Peter said, we will be going into more detail of what you can be doing to prepare for this if an adequate decision or trade deal is not put in place in the webinar next week. So moving on to our next one then, this one is regarding PayPal and fraud victims. So it is said that PayPal is letting down its fraud victims. So PayPal actually hold a banking license and offer its own protection policy in terms of fraud and payments that you have not made yourself. But it has, however, not joined the voluntary code of conduct for authorised push payments, which commits banks to reimbursing customers who have been tricked into parting with their money. So this lack of protection meant that some customers, including one I'm going to talk about in a while, have struggled to get their money back when they have been conned into sending the money to fraudsters or have been targeted by hackers who have taken control of their account. So this story actually talks about one gentleman who, I can't remember his name actually, but he actually got his account hacked into and had around £1,800 stolen by the hackers actually purchasing a number of mobile phones through his account and then sending them to Washington, DC. So he tried to get that money back by contacting PayPal, and after a few months of going back and forward with PayPal, they actually reimbursed him at first with only £800 because they said that they didn't think all of the payments were actually fraud. They thought they were legitimate. And the reason why he struggled doing that as well was because he actually got locked out of his account fully, as the hacker had changed his email address and everything, so he couldn't get into his account to prove that the payments wasn't his. So eventually they did refund him the whole money, but it did take a long time to do so. But I think you said you wanted to speak about, Peter, how a lot of the banks have actually signed up to this code and have refunded a lot of people over the past year, also since it's been in force, but now wanted to kind of back out of it because they didn't realise how much they would be having to refund.
Thanks, Laura. Yes, that's quite right. I think as we've ended up having, of course, a huge increase in the volume of digital transactions this year, with us all having to do our shopping and our payments from home, then of course there's been more fraud, and the banks have made this commitment to abide by this voluntary code, and of course they've had to make higher and higher payments to those who are victims of fraud and may end up making being victims of these sorts of tricks and scams. And so we've got here PayPal doing that typical, let's make this as difficult as possible, and then we might be able to get out of paying some or all back to the individual. But I think the banks as a whole are starting to question whether they have to pay out as much as they currently are doing. And I mean, we've had, haven't we, Laura, people coming to our firm giving us examples of where they've, been victims of fraud. So one chap came to us and turned out that he was in communications with his financial advisor, and at some point it turned out he was speaking to a hacker rather than the financial advisor, and lost a large proportion of his pension funds. But I think the nature and sophistication of the different hacks that people fall victim to is multiplying as well, and it seems that the banks are increasingly trying to backtrack on their responsibility as a result. Yeah,
absolutely. I think that signing up to this code looks good on certain banks, and will gain them more custom in terms of people wanting to switch banks where they think they will have more protection. But the fact that then the banks are trying to get out of this is kind of getting rid of the whole benefit of changing to a bank who is signed up to this code, because they're not really applying to it anyway.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. This certainly should be something that if you are a consumer and you are out there either setting up a current account for the first time or looking to move accounts, I would look very, very carefully at the reputation for a bank in terms of how it handles and reimburses cases of fraud, because I think now, unfortunately, we have to take a position of it's not if, but when you might be a victim of fraud. And you want to make sure that you're going to be helped, supported by your bank, and not hung out to dry and, you know, asked to sort of carry out the 12 tasks of Hercules or run some sort of horrific assault course before they'll think of making any payment or support to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So then we are staying on the fraud cyber attack front then. So this is to do with the European Medicines Agency, and they've actually said that they have been targeted by a cyber attack, but it has not yet been confirmed whether the attack was one, successful, or two, if it has had an impact on the agency actually approving COVID-19 vaccines. So the European Medicines Agency's main job at the moment is just getting these vaccines approved, and they've said they're not doing that until at least January, I think. But they have issued a statement saying that the EMA has been subject to a cyber attack. The agency has swiftly launched a full investigation in close cooperation with law enforcement and other relevant agencies. EMA cannot provide additional details whilst the investigation is ongoing, but further information will be made available in due course.
Thanks, Laura. I mean, clearly there's a matter of, yes, further information will be made available when that investigation is completed. But for now, let's just engage in some broad, mindless speculation. I mean, clearly it's quite shocking that a medicines regulator at, you know, this year of all years, when they're dealing with this incredibly important vaccination, that to have been targeted, you have to wonder, is this a nation state looking to take a look, get details with regards to the assessments and the vaccinations and how they've performed? And let's face it, given the information you have to supply to a regulator in order to get that vaccination passed, you could be looking at actually some quite sensitive, confidential and commercially sensitive information that, who knows, could allow someone, if they were in the process of trying to develop a vaccine, to then copy that research. So I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility, as I say, to think that this could be a nation state behind this attack. And indeed, it could be a state wanting to disrupt the approval by the European Medicines Agency of the various COVID vaccines. As you quite rightly say, that, you know, the EMA won't be authorising any vaccines until the new year. And you know, if that process could be disrupted, you could disrupt the rollout of those vaccines across the European 27 member states, because while the member states do have their own regulators, there was a collective decision to say, yes, let's have this managed at a European level and make a collective European decision. So, you know, take down the EMA, you take down the vaccine rollout across the member states, which could have, let's face it, massive consequences for each day that the virus is out there without people being vaccinated. People will be affected, and there will be fatalities. So it's quite sinister, really, to have targeted that organisation at this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of the cyber attacks that we see is kind of towards less light-hearted to such organisations, and they don't have that massive impact on like the economy. Well, not the economy, but a lot of the population if that attack is successful. So if this is successful, it could have the drastic effect not only on the people whose data has been stolen, if it is, for example, like trials, who's had the vaccination in the trials, etc., but also on the people who could get that in the future.
Absolutely. So
moving on then, so this is a story from the NCSC. So this is regarding a critical risk to the unpatched Fortinet VPN devices. So the NCSC advisory details important steps to be taken to reduce a critical risk to unpatched Fortinet VPN devices. So in late November of this year, credentials of 50,000 vulnerable Fortinet VPNs worldwide were actually stolen and published in a hacker forum. So the actual the actual risk is from a update that should have been taken place in 2018 or late 2019. And basically the NCSC are advising that everybody checks that the 29 updates have been installed, and if they haven't, then the NCSC actually recommends to do the following. As soon as it is possible, all devices that haven't been updated with this new technology should be removed from service, returned to factory default and actually reconfigured, and then returned to services again, just to make sure that hackers have not actually used the vulnerability to get into the system, just to make sure that it's absolutely safe, and obviously update the VPN as well.
Thanks for that. I mean, this is there's a couple of big takeaways from this. One is that, I mean, Fortinet is one of the big commercial VPN suppliers out there. So never great to hear that they've had a vulnerability with their own system. It also shows that if you have a VPN, it does not necessarily mean that you are entirely safe and secure from being compromised, because that VPN can itself be compromised. But also, I think really good to see that the NCSC is issuing this notice and is issuing this guidance. This is what it's there for. You know, that the NCSC, as the sort of civilian wing of GCHQ, has led the way as a government agency, investigating and publicising risks like this. And in this instance, it's also highlighting the fact that, you know, you have to make sure that updates are installed. I think sometimes we can get rather tempted when it comes to things like operating systems and VPNs and other systems. We can sometimes think, I'm going to delay installing an update, because sometimes an update can mean that an element of compatibility with another app or program might be compromised. That does sometimes happen, but I think the overall purpose of an update is, as well as sometimes changing things like how a screen might look and the shape and colour of different buttons on an app, it's also more importantly updating very often the security architecture in the background. And there's a reason why that's being updated. It's to close down potential vulnerabilities and keep users safe. So therefore, you have to make sure that these updates are installed. And if you, for any reason, you're blocking them, I think that needs to be rectified, as the NCSC are saying in this instance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this just highlights the fact that we always recommend that people do the updates as soon as they are available, just to make sure that all vulnerabilities are closed down.
Exactly.
So just for the last story of today then, so this is just a couple of ICO fines that have recently been taken. So the first one is on the Pension House Exchange, which is a London-based company, and they have been fined £45,000 for making more than 39,000 nuisance calls to people about their pensions. And then the second one is OSL Financial Consultancy Limited, and they have been fined £50,000 for illegally sending 174,342 nuisance marketing texts. So I think the important message that we just wanted to say here is just that sending mass marketing and doing these nuisance calls and things like that do have big impacts, and it is important to make sure the marketing you're doing is obviously lawful. And just to show that even though there's a lot going on at the moment in the world and in the UK, that the ICO are still continuing to investigate these things and actually administer fines as well.
Indeed. I think the only thing I'd add to that is just to say that interesting here that we're looking at bulk marketing. So, you know, bulk phone calls, you know, there's nuisance calls and nuisance marketing text. Likewise, things like nuisance emails can draw the attention of the ICO. They tend to start investigating here because they'll have been notified by thousands of recipients of these texts and emails and calls, and that's when they then trigger an investigation. So the headline isn't so much the size of the fine as much as the fact they investigated and have then said, here's the fine, and furthermore, stop doing this, stop mithering people in a manner that is supposed to be prohibited. And and indeed, as you quite rightly say, Laura, you know, they're continuing to roll out enforcement like this, despite the fact the ICO is currently swamped with requests and notifications with regards to breaches of data protection legislation and privacy legislation, and the fact that the ICO, like everyone else, has currently got an awful lot of people working from home. They're still getting the work done. They're still rolling out the enforcement notices.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's everything we've got time for today in today's episode. So just as a reminder for our listeners, we've got a special offer on still for the GDPR compliance manual for legal practices. So this was originally on sale in May 2018 for £195. So this is down around 50% and is now on sale for £99. So it's available in digital copy and hard copy as well for an extra £5 for postage and packaging. So I'll just hand over to Peter just to give you a little bit more information about the manual.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So this is our GDPR manual, which contains helpfully all of the forms and templates and checklists to give your organisation a shot at being able to deal with your compliance needs. It is designed for law firms, but we have had other organisations such as accountants and those in financial services purchasing it because they found that a lot of the guidance that we give in there is helpful. We give a lot of advice in there with regards to, you know, what good practice looks like, and also a few horror stories about what bad practice looks like too. And it basically sort of gives you all of the tools that you need to be able to work to bring yourself up to the standards that GDPR requires, because GDPR is very good at setting out standards, it doesn't really tell you how to achieve them. And also just a quick shout out as well for the webinar that we are doing next week. Details on our website, and I'm sure we'll try and put the link as well in the notes to this recording and in the podcast as well. So if you are interested in hearing more about the UK's departure from the EU and what organisations need to do to make sure you can continue to access your data, then please do feel free to register for that free webinar. Hope we see you there.
Thanks, Peter. So yeah, just a reminder for everyone listening, this is available as a webinar and a podcast, and so you can access it through our website, our YouTube channel, or on all the podcast channels. So yeah, I will add the information about the webinar in the description on both of the podcast and the webinar as well, so you'll be able to find it easier. But if you have any questions about that, do feel free to drop us an email, admin@Digital Law UK. So thank you for listening. I will hopefully see you next week.